Hi everyone and welcome. In today's discussion, we are joined by Evarist Bartolo, who is Malta's former Minister of Foreign and European Affairs. So, welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for this invitation.
So, as the former Foreign Minister of Malta, you have some good insights on Europe's view on the world and its own position in this world. Um, Besides having the experience of a practitioner, you also write a lot about both the past and the future of Europe and Europe's relationship with the rest of the world. Now, yeah, this is a topic I think a lot about because over the past 500 years, Western maritime powers they began to connect, conquer, and control much of the world, and we often focus on the material power, the sea power, weapons technology, and later the economic dominance. But with this concentration of power, the ideas of dominance also become important to explain the world, why dominance is virtuous, and you frame this in the language of a civilizing mission. How do you see Europe's how Europe views the world, and to what extent does it make foreign policy more difficult?
Obviously, in my case, I'm working away from my geographical position, which is a group of small islands below Italy, that is the Maltese Islands. And for thousands of years, and especially for the last 500 years, we've been a frontier. We haven't been a place of encounter of civilizations. We've been the frontier, especially in the last 500 years, uh, even before, against Islam. You know, that we are the bastion of Christian Europe to save us from Islam. Eventually, I think it developed even more to be also a bastion of Catholic Europe, saving us also from the Orthodox religion. I think this is not understood well enough. And we need to understand it because I think it explains how the kind of wall, literally, uh, they used to call it the Antemurale Christianitas, which was a kind of religious wall that you build around southern Eastern Europe to save you not just from Islam, but also from being contaminated by Orthodox Christianity. And I think that has morphed into making this area then become NATO to save Europe from not just Islam, but also from the East, in this case, from Russia. Even, I think, even in a secular world of today, where, you know, there was a big controversy that when the Constitution of the European Union was being written, there was no mention of Christianity. I think we have inherited the last 500 years since in 1400s, the Pope had come out with the doctrine of discovery, which actually told the colonizers of the day, in this case it was Spain and Portugal, go to the barbarous nations that are not inhabited by Christians. And over there you can do whatever you like. You can take them because you know they are inhabited by non-Christian barbarous people. I think this kind of doctrine, which was it was called the doctrine of discovery. It was actually the doctrine of domination. Why am I mentioning? People might be saying, because sometimes they told me this when I mention it, but why are you going back 500 years? These things are not there anymore. And I remind them, isn't it interesting that it was only Pope Francis who withdrew this doctrine of discovery from Vatican teachings? It had to be a pope who came from the continent, which was actually invaded and barbarized in the name of the gospel, in the name of God. Previous popes had been told, both John Paul II and Pope Benedict had been told to withdraw it. It's interesting that they did not want to withdraw it. I think it's interesting because it shows that it had to be a pope who was coming from the global south to actually, because what I think what is interesting, Glenn, is that the changes that we're seeing with the decline of the West and the decline of the European Union and the emergence of BRICS, for example, that movement is happening within the Christian and the Catholic world as well. It is now the global South that is rising in Catholicism. And I want to mention this because if you remember, even a few, I think it was last year or the year before, there was still the language in the European Union of the European Union being a garden and the rest of the world, especially the global South, being a jungle that needs to be civilized. So this kind of language of not just civilization versus barbarism, but also the good versus evil. And then this kind of manichaeistic theological position of the good versus evil, it's very easy to say that the Islam is evil and the East, in this case, Russia and China, is actually has replaced evil. In fact, there is a very interesting study by the American Institute of Diplomacy, which actually mentions this, that the kind of manichaeistic good evil of Christianity of before has been changed into now China and Russia are the role of the evil forces, and I think we need to understand this because sometimes I'm also asked that I've just spent two weeks in Trinidad and Tobago, and I was very lucky. I consider myself very lucky to have been only in the presence of former colonized colleagues coming from Africa, coming from Latin America, coming from the Caribbean, and coming from the Indian Ocean. And as I come from the periphery of Europe, and we are one of the few countries in the European Union, we didn't have an empire, we were actually colonized, we can understand the global South much more than those who were colonizers, because I think colonizers in the European Union, and even obviously in the United States, find it difficult to understand how the rest of the world sees them. They are still seen as colonizers because I think the mindset of superiority and we come to tell you what to do is still there. Is still there.
There's a fascinating historical continuity though, because once you frame dominance as a force for good, the back in the 19th century, as you suggested with the garden and the jungle, this was framed in the language of a liberal empire that it might be necessary to spread these ideas to dominate others. So you bring, again, this is where the civilizing mission came in, the white man's burden. But in the more contemporary era, we now don't talk about liberal empire, we talk about liberal hegemony. But the premise is to a large extent the same. That is, we recognize that in order for the liberal democratic good values to prevail, the West has to dominate, and the dominance of the West becomes a force for good in the world. And it's also, as you mentioned, with the garden and the jungle, I thought it was interesting that the EU foreign policy chief, former Josep Borrell, actually used this word again when this is, the garden and jungle. This is what Robert Cooper, the advisor of Tony Blair, argued. We need another liberal empire because, we are civilized in Europe, but when we enter the world, we have to realize that the civilized world rules don't apply anymore. Now we have to operate by the law of the jungle, and again, we have to temper the jungle before the jungle invades the garden. This is colonial talk. Now I bring this up because this affects, doesn't it, how you would engage with the rest of the world? Because how would you have a diplomacy? Do you pursue mutual understanding and compromise, or is the world then inherently seen as a subject versus the object? The teacher versus the student. How does diplomacy within the European Union take place when this mentality still prevails?
Well, I can tell you that from my own experience of the Foreign Affairs Council and operating as a member of the European Union, diplomacy was not even considered seriously. You shouldn't even waste time in diplomacy. Whenever, for example, we discuss the Eastern Mediterranean and the tension between Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, and Egypt, and I used to talk about the importance of talking to all of them and trying to find a way of them working together, I used to be told you're being naive. So now it has become, I think in the last 30 years, using diplomacy has become naive. What is wise is to sell arms and to mobilize people for wars. I think this has to do as well, unfortunately, with some of the countries in the European Union where the very important sector in their industry is actually the armaments industry. For example, if you take France, I would consider it as very crucial for them in terms of industry. Had their leading industrial sector been shoes, instead, I think, of fomenting conflict to have wars, they would be selling a lot of shoes. But obviously, selling armaments is much more profitable. What I really worry about is that, first of all, I think that the biggest challenge that the whole world faces is the ability to live together. I mean, 8 billion people with so many different religions, so many different languages, so many different culture. It is always going to be a big challenge to live together. But what is most worrying is because there is a section of these people on this planet who do not want to live with others. They want to live over others. So it's not just a matter of a clash between a unipolar world and a multipolar world or a multinodal world. It's the difference between having a vertical relationship with the rest of the world and a horizontal one. And what I really am convinced about is that this idea of trying to put into practice the Charter of the United Nations about the equality of nations, large and small, should not be considered romantic or should not be considered naive. And I explain why. Glenn, there is a person who unfortunately is not known a lot. He was called Enrico Mattei. Enrico Mattei was an Italian, a very interesting engineer, entrepreneur, who way back in the late 50s and the early 60s, so we're talking a few years after the Second World War, broke the logic of the spheres of influence and challenged those that were called at that time the Seven Sisters in the oil sector. These were the US companies, the UK companies, French and Dutch. And he used to go to Iran, he went to Tunisia, he went to Saudi, he went even to Russia, and told them, especially when we're talking about North Africa, used to tell them, and the Middle East, the resources that you have in your land, the oil resources, those are yours. Those are sovereign resources. You should not allow your former, colonizers to take them and give you just a few crumbs. So he used to formulate contracts with them, 50-50, literally. He saw them as partners. So they used to sign deals which were 50-50, and he used to give them 75% of the profits that they made. The American companies and the British companies and the French companies and the Dutch companies were furious with him. They did not accept this kind of partnership. Wonder of wonders, 61 years ago, he died in a plane crash, which has never been cleared up exactly. Did it happen by accident? What is important is that there were American companies and other companies, and even governments, because at one point, even President Kennedy, unfortunately, he hadn't yet had the experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I think that changed him a bit then. He called the Italian prime minister and told him, don't let Mattei operate like this, signing partnership agreements, 50-50 deals, because that's not the way to do business. We want to dominate. So what I'm saying is this, that it is possible, and it was possible even 60 years ago with people like Mattei, to build a relationship of partnership. That relationship of partnership today does not exist. If you look at the global gateway that the European Union has formulated as a response to the Belt and Road Initiative of China, you will see that it is completely vertical. It is completely what I want out of Africa, for example. It's not, let's change the structural relationship where we simply take fuel, primary products, raw material, and food from China, and we give them our finished products. Let's change that. Let's help to create a more equitable relationship with Africa. No. What do we need out of Africa? We take it because we need it and because we want it. In the global gateway, there is an African European Implementation Committee. There isn't a single African on it. And when they sat down to decide what to put in this global gateway initiative, they did not sit down with their African partners and say, listen, what can we do together? No, it's what I need as Europe, and this is what I want out of you. So this idea of a partnership, of having a horizontal relationship of equality is not there, is not there. So it is still the curse of domination. It's not called colonialism anymore. We use the correct political language of not using the word colonialism anymore. But strictly speaking, the relationship is still a colonial and a neo-colonial.
Yeah, it's interesting the comment you make about not having getting the input from the partners one actually cooperates with, because again, my main research focuses on Russia, and this was the main concern or complaint they had ever since the 90s. That is when the EU formulated common policy towards Russia. It was formulated without without the Russian participation, so the whole EU-Russia partnership didn't have input from the Russians. So again, it's the decision makers have to the decision makers have to be the hegemon, but it's not seen again as problematic. It's seen almost as a necessity because again, stand a bit taller, see a bit further, this kind of logic. And but this is why also from the Russians they have complained for the past 25 years plus that all diplomacy was thrown away and it was replaced with ultimatums and threats. So do this, and then you'll get a reward. If you don't do it, you get a punishment. So you take on, even the language we have is taken on very pedagogic function. So Africa's behaving poorly. They have to be punished. Oh, they behaved good. Now they have to be rewarded. This is not how you talk about equals. Now, my main concern though is I feel Europe is well, making life very difficult for itself because we live in this time we have this huge shift of balance of power away from Europe. So Europe is not the dominant continent it was in previous century. So there has to be also a change in the mindset, but I don't really see it. For example, when India has risen dramatically, UK has declined relatively. The British still feel comfortable to go and tell the Indians what kind of foreign policy they should have. So the EU feels like they can tell China what to do. We just lost the war against Russia, and the EU sets ultimatums. Even now, I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And I also feel the stability of the world depends on the two great economies, US and China, finding some common ground. But the idea in Washington that they should stand on equal footing, that the Chinese are equals, it's not accepted. And I think if they could accept this, it would be a lot of opportunities, which would be mutually beneficial and for the world. By the way,
Yes, I think, Len, it's tragic for you because I mean, this year, this is 2025. We should have been celebrating 50 years of the Helsinki CSCE OSCE dream, which unfortunately has turned into a dead nightmare. I mean, imagine the kind of statesmen we had who thought of building blocks, of creating a Europe to heal the division, even at the worst times of the Cold War. I'm thinking of people like Palme, people like Brandt, people like Kekkonen. They had dreams of bringing Europe together, even during the Cold War. Today, 50 years later, instead of climbing on the shoulders of those giants and seeing further and building something which was stronger, and the opportunity was there with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was a different direction altogether. Again, going for domination instead of coexistence, because OSCE is about peaceful coexistence. You find you have conflicts, you have different interests, but let's sit down and see what we can do about them. With OSCE, that was possible. With CSCE, that was possible. But then, once you take the decision, I don't care what the Russians consider as being their security concerns. I remember discussions in the Foreign Affairs Council when they say it's not their business. If we want Ukraine to join NATO, it's up to us. I mean, it's a sovereign decision. Well, what do you mean? And if some of us reminded that in the OSCE there is that my security and your security are indivisible, and I cannot and I shouldn't take any step which risks or put at risks or endangers your security, so that we will have the common European home that Gorbachev had dreamt of. No. That's a waste of time. That's a waste of time. And this is tragic because there was a decision taken, after. I feel quite strongly about this because it was in December 1989 in Malta when Bush told Gorbachev, we will not take an advantage of what is going to happen in Eastern Europe when you let go and you allow different countries to have different political systems. We will not take an advantage. At that time, the famous not an inch closer, not yet been uttered, but it was on the way. But instead of doing that, no, now is the time to dominate. And this brings me back to, I think it was George Kennan, way back in 1948, when after the Second World War, he said, now there's a big disparity between us and the rest of the world. We're just over 6% of the population. He said that we have 50% of the wealth. And this will create envy. This will create a lot of anger against us and resentment. Let us make sure that we will take all the necessary steps to ensure that we continue to dominate. And let us forget, idealistic values of human rights and democracy. We should go for real power politics now. Forget empathy, and this was dangerous because I think since then this is what has happened. To choose the politics of domination instead of the politics of coexistence. And in a world where we have so many thousands of nuclear weapons and more weapons are becoming more sophisticated than ever before, we need coexistence better and stronger than before, because otherwise we're going to destroy humanity.
Well, I like that you brought it back to the Helsinki Accords, because this was really in 1975 when we got the initial framework for how a divided Europe could begin to move together and actually cooperate and overcome the bloc politics. And of course, this was built upon after the Cold War. So again, it was announced over in Malta in 89. In 1990, we have this Charter of Paris for New Europe. We're not going to have dividing lines. We're going to stop having, all this bloc politics. And as you said, in 1994, we take these ideas from Helsinki. We create the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, an actual inclusive security institution for Europe. So we're going to finally transition beyond this bloc politics. But then instead, this whole thing goes down the toilet because we instead going to expand NATO. And now the logic, as you said, NATO will represent Europe. Russia's not part of NATO. Everyone else should be. So now the largest country in Europe is the only one who is not represented in Europe. And somehow this is meant to be the source of stability. And that's obviously as you said, the whole premise of how could this possibly work? How would this create not war, but stability? Well, the whole premise was that the West would be so dominant that it wouldn't matter what the Russians would think. However, obviously now that we see this huge shift of power, the dominance of the West is over. Yet we're not willing to go back and revisit how we ended up in this. What decisions did we make? We sabotaged the efforts to overcome the bloc politics. We revived bloc politics, believing this would advance the hegemonic era. But now that hegemonic era is over, surely we should go back to looking at
Yeah.
how we can overcome bloc politics. But instead, we use the war in Ukraine now, which is a direct result of NATO expansion, and we use it as a reason why we can never work with the Russians again. I mean, you mentioned Kennedy has some aggression after World War II, when he, of course, refers to the power disparity, but even him after the Cold War recognized that this is complete madness. We're starting a new Cold War with the Russian. We're going to provoke a war, and it's going to be our fault. And these days, you can't make this argument anymore. That's what I want to ask as well. How did you find the discussions? Because again, as a foreign minister, you talk with the other European leaders. What, how do they address the topic of Russia? Because you were there when Russia invaded in 2022 as foreign minister. How was this discussed? What was the extent of the debates?
No need to tell you, no more discussing the concept of a common security architecture for Europe. Not even discussed, even though, to be fair, Russia, on the eve of the invasion, reminded the European Union again of all the commitment made through the OSCE of building a common security architecture. Unfortunately, even the working method of the Foreign Affairs Council inbuilt in it is very defective. There isn't any serious discussion. And I can tell you, the kind of attitude of domination towards the rest of the world is then translated into total subordination to Washington when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. So I remember being in a informal foreign affairs ministers meeting in Slovenia when the US left Afghanistan. The ministers were stunned because not only these were all people who attend the ministerial meetings of NATO, not only were they not consulted, they were not informed. They found out about Afghanistan from the media like all the other people. So you can imagine that the kind of arrogance towards the Russians and towards the Chinese and towards the global South, I would say, it is then very sycophantic when it comes to Washington. Because I think what is happening, and I think this is tragic for Europe, what is happening is that they do sense the decline. They do not admit it. They do not admit it. But they see that the only way they can extend their dominance is to hang on to the coattails of the power in Washington. They on their own cannot do it. But if the United States can do it, let's hang on to the United States so that at least we will still form part of the 14% of the world which is dominant. But this is very short-sighted and very suicidal, because if you see what's going to happen in the next, let's take in the next 25 years in our continent, not to mention what's going to happen till the end of the century. There is, first of all, I think the very strong reality check of the demographic suicide of the European Union. Over the next years, the European Union is going to lose 57 million people of working age. So how is the economy of Europe going to function? How is it going to create enough wealth? Forget it, wealth for citizens. Take the present obsession with building the military complex of Europe. How can you build a military industrial complex if you don't have a strong industry? How can you build a strong economy in Europe if you have millions of vacancies because you don't have enough people? At the same time, you have allowed a toxic debate about migration. I mean, completely toxic. Even though there is the schizophrenia of officially saying, I don't want migrants to come, but then have agreements with different countries, especially India, to send engineers in energy and IT to work in your country, but please keep them away from public sites so that we can tell people, yes, yes, we are controlling migration. At the same time, if you see what's happening in technology, there is a very interesting institute. It's called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which tracks 67 technologies that are needed for the 21st century. Out of these 64 leading technologies, China leads in 57. India is in the second place, not even the United States. The United States has lost its historical advantage and is now leading in only 7 areas of technology. India is leading in more. The European Union is nowhere to be seen as a European Union. It can have an effect because apparently the European Union can be very strong in small satellites and in some sensory areas through what the Germans do. So when you have problems with economic wealth, technology, you have problems of governance because one country after the other is proving to be ungovernable. I mean, one country after the other find it very difficult to agree on the way forward. How then are you going to tell the rest of the world what to do? And I think the relationship the toxic relationship that has been built with Russia, and how can you have stability and peace and security in Europe without Russia? How can you do it? I mean, not to mention the importance of energy and how you built your economy on energy from Russia. But I see this as being very short-sighted and very suicidal. Not to mention then the total neglect, I think, of the European Union towards a very important neighbor, which is Africa. I mean, we're talking of a country where there are 3 Africans for every European. And in the coming years, there are going to be 5 Africans for every European. And usually the European would be elderly or middle-aged, whereas the Africans would be children and young people. How can you not take seriously your relationship with Africa because you are obsessed with what is happening on your eastern neighborhood and what's happening with China, and at the same time give the impression that you're still a very strong bloc and that you can dictate to the rest of the world what to do. I don't think that Europe is being taken seriously with that kind of gestures and theater.
It does seem more like theater these days, as you said. But what does again a key problem then is as the world becomes multipolar, there has to be some readjustments from between for the Europeans in the relationship with the United States. I think we became a bit strategically lazy over the years, as in the bipolar world after the Second World War. The world's divided into 2 camps. Everything is us or them. It's very simple. The EU and US partnership kind of becomes the basis. It even mitigates economic competition between the two, given that the overwhelming need for the military security against Soviet Union has to prevail first. And then you have a unipolar world order where the collective hegemony of the West should, again, have the common benefit of dominating the world. But in a multipolar system, you see now the interests beginning to diverge more and more. And if the EU wants to be an independent polar power, it has to diversify its foreign partnerships. And, for God's sake, having a divided continent is just going to be a disaster. We're going to be weaker. We're going to be used as pawns. We are no longer the objects. We're not the subjects anymore. We have become the objects of security. And there's no movement. It's almost a bit embarrassing when you listen to people like Vice President J.D. Vance, who tells the Europeans, listen, you have to stop behaving like vassals. We don't need vassals, we need partners. And, it's kind of strange that there's no more efforts to adjust to this. Because, well, when you speak with the European leaders, they at times they recognize the need to diversify, but why is this never put into policy or taken a step further?
They have to take steps. I mean, this is why I mentioned Enrico Mattei, because if the dominant approach within the European Union would be like Mattei, and I find it interesting that the Meloni government in Italy, in its program for Africa, it's called the Mattei program. It's interesting. It's sending a message, and the Africans understand why the word Mattei is used. I find it very interesting. But to do that, the European Union has to learn a bit of humility. They have to change the relationship with China, with Brazil, with India, with Russia, with the global south. Big countries that they used to dominate, they have to change that relationship from domination to coexistence. And to do that, you have to sit with your people and tell them, we are partners. Are they ready to do that? If they are not ready to do that, they will get lost more and more. And it's not in the interest of the European Union not to build these new relationships that are needed. Because now we are in a world where, you know, Glenn, that for you to dominate a country, okay, it depends a lot on your military technology and on your military power. But culturally, you also need, to a certain extent, that country to allow you to dominate it. Now, the global south is refusing to be dominated. And unless the European Union learns that, I used to have problems talking to my colleagues. Like, for example, in our case, and it's happening a lot also in these days. So we're talking here in mid May. We're having problems again in Libya, in Tripoli. The last few days, militias have been shooting at each other. There have been killings. There is still instability, and since 2011, because of also the NATO invasion, Libya, like Tunisia, is unstable. The Mediterranean is very unstable, you know, and the European Union does not pay any attention to what is happening over there. And I used to tell my colleagues, even Borrell, why don't you go down to Tripoli and see what we can do, how we can build? Because one of the big problems of the European Union, for example, towards Africa, is that the policy of the single countries is stronger than the policy of the European Union as a whole. So if France and Italy do not agree on how to deal with Libya, for example, so the Italians would support the government in the West. France would support the government in the East. So there is disagreement. So what does the European Union do? No common policy towards Libya. Italy does its bit, France does its bit. And I used to tell Borrell, why don't you go down and talk to the Libyans? And he used to tell me, but what shall I tell them? And I used to tell him, don't say anything. At first, here, listen to what they have to say. So the European Union, because of its politics of domination and culture of colonialism, has got spoiled with talking, but not listening. In a new world order, in a new multipolar, multinodal world, you cannot only talk, you have to listen. Are you ready to listen? And are you ready to treat others as partners? And if the European Union is not going to do this, it's going to create more problems for it. It's going to become more irrelevant. And this is going to have a huge problem for the standard of living and for people living in the European Union. Especially now, telling them we have to move from a welfare state to a warfare state because we need to spend 3.5%, 5% of your GDP on armament. So when there was the financial crisis, let us help the banks and save the banks, but not help the citizens. Now, okay, let's spend, let's not take any notice of the Maastricht regulations on the 3% deficit and borrowing money, it should be 60% of GDP and all this. For armaments, let's do it. people then become disenchanted even with democratic politics. And I think one of the biggest challenges facing the European Union now is not just the democratic deficit of, if you say, listen, let's have a bit of diplomacy, you will be accused of being Putin's puppet, because there is a kind of like McCarthyism in the 50s in the United States. We have a kind of McCarthyism in the European Union. You cannot talk about an alternative approach without being accused of sleeping with the enemy and of being a traitor, which is ridiculous. Because even for intellectual freedom, even if someone is telling you something which is a heresy, we used to pride ourselves of being a zone of freedom, of robust intellectual discussion, of thinking the unthinkable. Yeah, you cannot do that anymore. Yeah. There is a kind of very lazy group thing. We all think the same. And as someone said, when we all think the same, a lot of us are not doing any thinking at all. And that is a tragedy for the European Union. I mean, how are you going to move forward if more people will feel disenchanted and feel let down by their governments? And we are going to have a big problem, because the number of people who are dropping out of the political system are increasing, and it's very, I think it's very serious. Apart from the problems of people finding it difficult to meet the bills of their energy, and to think of having prosperity for the future. Also in terms of political culture and political democracy, it's a problem. It's a problem.
Yeah, I only moved back to Europe about 5 years ago, and one of the biggest shocks for me was when nobody discusses the security concerns of opponents here. That is, what are the Chinese worried about? What are the Iranians worried about? What are the Russians worried? They don't do this, which means that you can't enhance security by mitigating their security concerns. And the only path to more security is therefore containment, deterrence, defeating on the battlefield. There's no recognition at all, and indeed, bringing it up comes with a very high social cost. I mean, on the war in Ukraine, for 20 years I've been saying the same thing. That is, if NATO attempts to push into Ukraine, Russia will destroy Ukraine. This is it. There's no statement of support, nothing, just reality as it should be very evident. But it's impossible to make this argument. If you say this, well, you legitimize, you support it. That's what Putin says. People suggest there's a moral need to support, irrespective of what Russia would do. But when you look into it, really, it was only 20% who wanted to be part of NATO when we toppled the government in 2014. Also, I question the morality of pushing NATO in. We know it can't be done, and it will lead to the destruction. It's just this. It's impossible to even discuss a very simple argument, and it's not even as they say. Oh, this is what Putin says, but this is also what how seemingly half the American political leadership said in the 90s. That is, if we expand NATO, we're going to provoke a conflict with the Russians. This is all the way in the top governments in the United States in the 90s. Everyone said this. But these days, if you say it, you're smeared in the media for being repeating Kremlin talking points. It's just the brainwashing now is complete. It's total. There is the propaganda is so overwhelming. There's no dissent anymore in society. It's quite frightening, and they all seem convinced that they're on the right side of history because they're standing up against evil, and it's yeah, as you said, everything is this good versus evil. There's no nuance. No one's questioned exactly what has been our role in provoking this war, or indeed starting this war in 2014. Only this very strange narratives which have to conform to this very cartoonish view of an evil empire and this liberal democratic grouping which stands up. Apparently, we're trying to help Ukraine. That's what we've been doing for a decade. I don't know how. At least I see it from an academic perspective. How there's nothing there. But did you have any, I guess, problems trying to get your point across to other foreign ministers and European leaders?
Yes, yes, you are a part of all. First of all, you are dismissed as, in my case, I was coming from education and employment. My political career was built mainly on education, and so when I joined, they used to tell me, "Ah, you're coming from education. A lot of values that have to do with humanistic values, and you are naive." And I used to tell them, "Well, I think education has prepared me very well because one of the biggest challenges we had was bullying in schools." And I think now in the international playground, we're seeing a different kind of bullying, which is even more dangerous than what we have in schools. You are dismissed, you are ignored, you're written off as being naive, of being ineffective. And what is becoming frightening is, and this is what's bound to happen, if you're talking of regime change and color revolutions outside the European Union, you will start practicing them within the European Union as well. So if you see a candidate who you think shouldn't be there, or if there is a political party who you think shouldn't be there, see what manipulation you can do not to let that person be elected, or if they are elected, consider seriously to make them illegal. Now, this is very dangerous. I mean, I felt, I don't know whether I had to smile or to cry when Vance came to the Munich Security Conference to talk the way he did, because what is happening in the United States as well is definitely not an example to follow. Because if you support Palestine, you are also considered, somebody to be rid of. So they are not really leading by example at all. But the same thing is happening in the European Union with what we were saying, that it's not even possible to have a discussion and a reflection on where we are going. And this has serious implications because I think it's really short-sighted. I was in the Foreign Affairs Council when we were discussing strategic autonomy. What strategic autonomy are we? We're not even strategy, let alone autonomy. We are being strategically blind and strategically, suicidal, I would say, because you must think of what's going to happen in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time, in 4 years' time. Perhaps the present leadership is hoping that in 2 years' time, Trump will lose the election, at the midterm election, and the neocons or the neolibs will come back, and somehow or other they will extend the politics of domination on the rest of the world. If they can't do it directly, they at least do it by proxy. At least they will have reflected power and reflected glory. But this is being very short-sighted. In the meantime, we should be adjusting ourselves to the new world, not to be inferior to anyone, but not to be superior, but at least to be equal. And to do that, you need to change your mentality, you need to change your behavior, and you need to accept to work with others as partners. Now, is Europe, with the tradition of being so dominant and believing to be on a force for good, and the top civilization, and we know best, and God is on our side, is it ready to change that behavior and that mindset and sit down with others as partners? I remember, I used to appeal to the different sections and the different rivals in Libya, quoting the famous Mandela maxim. No, you need to talk to your enemies, not to your friends. To your friends, you don't need to talk because you are friends. You need to sit down with your enemy and talk to them, and your enemy will become your partner. And they used to tell me, "Oh, you're telling this to the Libyans." I used to tell them, "But we need to practice it as well. Don't be shocked that the Libyans don't practice it. Are we sitting down with our enemies to talk to them and see together how we address our challenges? No, we're not."
Um, I think we have to relearn diplomacy again. Like you said,
Exactly.
it's diplomacy is not an instrument anymore to resolve competing interests or conflicts. It's a way to reward or punish. In the relationship between NATO and Russia, they set up the NATO-Russia Council, and it was supposed to, address this kind of issues. As soon as the Georgian conflict started in 2008, the first impulse was, well, we have to send a message that we do not like their behavior. They're being a bad schoolboy. And so we're going to suspend cooperation. So when you need it the most, the diplomacy shuts down. And for me, this has been one of the greatest tragedies of all. The war now in Ukraine, 3 years of no diplomacy, just standing on the sideline and arguing that this was virtuous, that we're not going to talk to the Russians. Instead, we're just going to sit on the sideline and watch all these people die. I don't know, for me, it's been,
I
yeah,
used
it's
to tell them, Glenn, because I agree with you completely. I had a favorite quote from a British military historian, because I used to tell them, okay, I come from education. I'm not going to quote Saint Francis of Assisi and peace and, singing together and becoming angels. I used to quote because I think it's really good. Basil Little Heart. And this is what he says about diplomacy. I want to make sure that I quote every word of it. He says, when you're dealing with enemies, keep strong, if possible. In any case, keep cool. Have unlimited patience. Never corner an opponent. And always assist him to save his face. Put yourself in his shoes so as to see things through his eyes. Avoid self-righteousness like the devil. Nothing is so self-blinding. We do the opposite.
very much.
We do the opposite. And I remember, and this is really tragic. I really like the one of the speeches that John Kennedy gave just 6 months before he died, when he spoke to the students of the Washington University, when he was actually telling them this, that we should stop seeing ourselves as good and the Soviet Union as evil. We inhabit the same planet. They also have children. They also want to have a life like us. We should sit down together and see what we can do, because in the nuclear age, you cannot afford to have your enemy feeling humiliated. And obviously, he learned this through the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, imagine if the Cuban Missile Crisis were to happen today, the kind of leaders that we have. They will not accept to have, diplomacy, to send messages, to have ambassadors meeting, because it's only diplomacy that saves the world at that point, nothing else. Diplomacy, trust, courage, and wisdom. And I don't see any wisdom in today's leaders.
Well, on that very correct but sad point,
Yeah, very
yeah,
sad. Yeah.
we can leave it there. So, yeah,
Well,
Evarist,
well, Glenn, at
yeah,
least, because I hate leaving on a sad note, but
yeah,
uh,
that's
there is there is there is Frankel, no, Viktor Frankel, who used to say about tragic optimism that the world is in a very sad state. But if we don't do our best, things will only get worse. So we must continue to do what we can, however we can, not to let humanity destroy itself.
I agree. That's a much better note to leave it at. So,
Yes.
Viktor Frankl, yeah. Thank you so much, Evarist Bartolo. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Glenn. All
Thank you.
the
Bye.
best. Thank you.